Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope coming to you once again this week from Houston in Texas. We're going to start off this show by discussing Poland. Two far-right extremists there have been charged with plotting what's being called a Christchurch-style terror attack. And this was specifically on a mosque in Poland. This also involved a bomb and poison as well to, quote-unquote, prevent the Islamization of the country. The two men are known to have made calls to exterminate Muslims and, as I said already, took inspiration from the Christchurch terrorists as well. Is this specific to Poland? Certainly not. It's a Europe-wide issue, and it's not just limited, certainly, to just Muslims either, but it does seem that Islamophobia is currently, at least, the form of hatred that is carrying forward some form of violence. And this is, as we know, already happened in Christchurch and in other places around the world also. So this is worrying. But is there a Polish context as well? And that's something that I want to understand from both of our esteemed guests who are joining us right now. We're joined up by Dr. Katarzyna Górak-Sosnowska, who is an associate professor at the SGH Warsaw School of Economics. She's joining us today from Warsaw. Joining us from Lublin is Dr. Michał Kotnarowski, who is a political science scholar. He's at the Institute of Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. Michał and Katarzyna, thank you both for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us here in Scope. Michał, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this plot? Is it a surprise that this is happening in Poland?
So I would say I'm surprised because, like, we, first of all, in Poland, we do not have Muslims, actually. So the percentage of Muslims is less than 0.2. So it's like 50,000 of Muslims out of 38 million of Poles. So we do not have this, like, social conflicts, economic conflicts, cultural conflicts, which are still active, which could be active among Muslims and Poles. So as we wrote with my colleague Agnieszka Dudzińska for the report for Brookings Institution, so then we have imaginary Muslims. So there are ordinary people do not know Muslims, do not have contact with Muslims. So here these are like a more radical extremist activists who did it, who were inspired. I would say they were inspired by these events which happened in New Zealand, and they admitted that they were inspired by it. However, still, I am surprised, but on the other hand, we have like a political mainstream parties which raised Islamophobic issues in the political agenda. So it means that some extremist groups could be somehow encouraged to act in such a way, but I still hope that it's not. I still hope it's like very extreme reactions of some people and of a few people who were captured by the police.
Katarzyna, as Michał there said, I was looking at the statistics of how many Muslims there are in Poland as well, and certainly the number is quite low in context of, the population. But nevertheless, for these extremists to plan something out so brazen, it shows the level of hatred. I mean, is it down to the fact that there is ignorance, or is it simply that they were, inspired by Christchurch, as we're made to believe?
Well, I would rather say that there is this, xenophobia in Poland. But take a look at our society. We are a very homogeneous one, culturally, ethnically, religiously. So if you take into account that 12% of Polish population knows directly a Muslim person, it makes the problem bizarre and really it's like Islamophobia without Muslims. And the problem here is that on one side, we have the political mainstream agenda. It's not something peripheral. It's mainstream political agenda, the mainstream political party that we have at the moment that has allowed this kind of Islamophobic discourse into mainstream politics. So it's not like in Germany where you have the Alternative für Deutschland, and it occupies a minority position. It goes to the mainstream. But on the other side, if you take a look at the history of Poland, when the Western world used to have this colonial, well, there was colonialism. We were struggling for our independence. Then there was this decolonialization of the world and migration from Asia, from Africa to Europe. We were in Poland behind the Iron Curtain. We were closed. And now suddenly the borders got open. We joined the European Union and we have no experience of multiculturalism, because everybody is the same, you know. I was running a project on intercultural education. You know, this is by dry run. How can you teach about others if the others are not there? How can you, in a way, counteract to this Islamophobic narrative if there are hardly any Muslims present in the public space? So that's why people are so very... maybe not eager, but easy to accept this Islamophobic narrative, which was, as I said, you know, put into the mainstream political agenda by the Peace Party that is ruling at the moment.
All right, so then, Michael, where does the solution lie then? Is it as Katarzyna and you have already alluded to, the lack of education that needs to be fixed? Is it that we need better curriculum, for example, in schools when being taught about the world around them?
So I still think I would go to this to what Katarzyna said about politicians. So like Polish Islamophobia, I would say that it's dependent so much on the political agenda and what politicians says, and then the solution could be change of narration from politicians. So one option, if it's possible. So what we observed is that before. So it started actually in 2015 elections, and unlucky for us was that migration crisis was at the time of electoral campaign, and Law and Justice Party, which is in government right now, tried to compete with the radical right with using these Islamophobic issues and anti-refugee discourse. So at the time, like before electoral campaign, like 40% of Poles were against refugees, and after electoral campaign, 72. So we see that clear effect of political agenda to political discourse to framing attitudes, opinions. So I would say that change could be that many things depends on the politicians, but we have limited access to the actions and to force them to convince them to change. But I would say that we have some like good examples which could make people think about the good sides of migration, of multiculturalism. For example, the issue that vaccine for the COVID was invented in Germany by the part of Turkish migrants, and these are like a good examples which could resonate into society. That with migration, it's not only bad thing. It could have some positive aspects. So my hope is also that because these opinions on refugees, on Islam, on Muslims changed so rapidly, like in terms of Islamophobic way, in Islamophobic way, then it's also possible to have some actions which make them down, which make the situation more normal, less Islamophobic. So I hope they are no such stable in people's minds, so that these attitudes are not deeply rooted in people's minds. From the fact that they change so quickly. But maybe I'm too optimistic in this reason.
Katarzyna, if you can hear me, just tell me what you think about what Michael there said about the fact that the migrant crisis may have been behind, stoking these sorts of feelings in Poland as well.
Yes, that's true. But it brings up one more issue that, we as Poland were actually not affected by the refugee crisis. Nobody wanted to come to Poland, and there were no, people, going through our country. Yet the narrative was very much anti-refugees and anti-Muslims. And this brings in this other dimension that, in a way, we want to be included into the European discourse, into what's going on in Europe. And this is, not the best way to do it through Islamophobic discourse, but in a way, we are a semi-periphery at the European Union. We want to join the core. we want to have the same problems or challenges that Germany or France or the UK have. So this is, this gives you the link, because if you listen about stop Islamization of Poland, I mean, we are 38 million people. How are you going to Islamize us? Who is going to Islamize us? The 40,000 Muslims? Yeah. Nobody is willing to come to us because we are not a migration destination country. So this is, these are some dreams that have to be also understood in this context, that despite the fact that we have joined the EU, we are still one of the poorest countries in there. We want to join, we want to be included. So, and as Michał has also mentioned, I would say that the problem is on the political agenda. There are NGOs, there are local Muslim communities who are willing to change this narrative, but it will not be successful if the top political actors are reproducing the same Islamophobic speech that is available, in Western Europe. It's in a way transplanted discourse that makes the thing so hard to fight with.
Michał, Katarzyna there just mentioned the economic context of the country as well. We see this in many places, right, around the world, where when you have an economic downturn, politicians turn towards hatred of some sort. So not just Islamophobia, but hatred or prejudice towards other groups of people or minorities of some sort. Do you think that is also possibly what's happening, again, because of what you mentioned about the migrant crisis, but also because politicians are trying to cover up their own incompetency in fixing the economy?
So I cannot say what will happen. It's difficult to say what will happen after the COVID crisis, because situation right now is quite unknown. But I can say what happened, what we had before the COVID pandemic situation. So the thing was, I would say that in Poland quite reverse that we could expect, in the way that actually Polish economy was growing, and then many Polish people went to Western countries, to UK, to Norway, to Ireland to work, and because economy was growing, we needed people to work for the construction workers, to building highways, and actually Poland needed before the COVID, Poland needed migrants to come to work because there were contracts with fixed time which needed to be finished on fixed time. So that's for this reason. So actually Polish economy needs migration, and also it was the situation. It was interesting paradoxical situation when the Polish Law and Justice government actually they provided some laws to enable people migrant from usually Eastern countries to come to Poland to work. They were highly criticized by the radical right activists that they are opening borders for people from foreign countries, from different culture. However, on the other hand, entrepreneurs wanted them. So the situation in Poland is quite strange in this way, because we need migration before the COVID we needed migration for our economy, because it's, as I said, it was actually the problem in Poland was lack of people to work. And even there was the quite funny situation that one of the ministries of the Law and Justice government, he openly said that we are providing some opportunities for migrants to come to Poland, and at the time afterwards he was fired from his position because radical right activists criticized government for it. However, government did some actions to enable migrants to enter Poland. So the situation is quite complex. And I will also add. Okay.
Sorry, I'm cutting you off, Michał. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We do sincerely appreciate Michał and Katarzyna for taking their time out of their respective busy schedules to speak to us and to provide us the context, right, about Poland. Because as I said in my introduction, we can talk about Islamophobia or any form of hatred and xenophobia towards any minority in any respective country in different contexts or in general, but every country has their own situation, and in Poland, it's interesting to know that that the migrant crisis may very well have contributed to that sort of narrative, and the fact that the population of Muslims is genuinely so low in comparison to the rest of the population that there simply isn't enough interaction really with the Muslims of Poland, so to speak, and then therefore it's very easy to, unfortunately, bring in incorrect narratives about Muslims in Poles' minds because they simply haven't had the chance to meet enough Muslims altogether. And we know as a fact that that's a fact anywhere in the world, when you have people-to-people contact between different minorities and the majority, that's always a good thing, that you get to understand each other more. And maybe that's what needs to occur more in Poland and elsewhere as well with such forms of xenophobia. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the U.S. Senate, which has now come under control of Democrats because of two key races that they've won in the state of Georgia. Now, those races, as I said, key and were hotly contested. What does this mean now then going forward for President-elect Joe Biden? What does this mean for policy making in the country? Will this make things easier? What kind of a say will Republicans then have? What kind of an influence will they have going forward as well on policy making before, of course, things become law, etc.? Those are all questions that are open. And of course, the context of all of this also, the elephant in the room is what's happened just over the past day or so with the storming of the U.S. Capitol. Also, what is that indicative of just anger towards the Congress/Senate and the Capitol and as a whole in that system? Because we know that Americans for a while now have been unhappy with how Congress and Senate function. And this is regardless of Republicans and Democrats. This is more of just an issue of how things function overall within those different chambers of power. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. And I'm joined this morning by who is an attorney. He's joining us from St. Paul in Minnesota. And we're also joined by Frank Sobchak, who is a retired colonel. He's also a PhD candidate of international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's joining us from Holliston in Massachusetts. Frank and Jeffrey, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Frank, let me start with you. What are these key wins for Democrats in Georgia mean? As I said, of course, the very clear reality now is the Democrats control the Senate. What does that mean then to you?
Thank you again for having me on. I think it really means that they're much more able to pursue their own agenda. They obviously control both the executive and legislative branches. Within the Senate, that means that they'll be able to any nominations that President-elect Biden puts forward, for example, whether it be for the very important Supreme Court, for the approximately 350 legislative positions within the federal government that are currently open, the 350 judicial positions that are currently open, the nominations for those would be much easier because they control the Senate. Additionally, they'll control all of the committees. Will have investigatory power. They'll have the ability to put forward legislation. They'll have the appropriations committees, the authorization committees, and investigative power. So it will really give them significant power. Now, because of the Senate rules of cloture, meaning that they have to have 60 votes or to be able to pass the filibuster, they will not have a kind of carte blanche, the ability to pursue their agenda. So there will be some challenges given those rules.
It does seem that at this point, the Republicans are going to have less influence. I mean, of course, they'll still very much be able to fight their case, won't they?
Waqar, the Senate definitely has, if the election results are taken as granted right now and nothing is done to overturn any of them. I mean, we're having two people who were elected in Georgia that were surprise victories. I mean, it's very hard to beat anyone in an incumbent Senate seat almost ever. I mean, it very rarely ever happens. And in Georgia, we have two people, one of whom was never even elected to public office before supposedly beating David Perdue. That's John Ossoff. So the election is hotly contested as far as whether there were fraud concerns, as we've seen over the last several days or last several weeks. It's received very little coverage. So I think the events at the Capitol yesterday, which were tragic and unfortunate, and arguably maybe even stoked by agitators, those look like an eruption of frustration that came up from out of nowhere because they weren't really covered in the media, unfortunately. So what's going on now is if the election stands, and I believe it looks at least like it probably will at this point, barring any other revelatory type evidence or something that's going to come in some sort of extreme measure. We're going to have a 50-50 Senate with the tie-breaking vote being Kamala Harris as the vice president, who's going to be able to step in. Very unlikely that we're going to be able to stop a whole lot of spending bills or defense bills or anything else as Republicans, because the Senate, essentially they're much more likely to go along with the Democrats. So even though we're going to need the 60 votes to prevent a filibuster, I don't believe there will be a whole lot of filibusters, given that it seems like the Senate's on the same page as the Democrats already. So I think Joe Biden's going to have, if he becomes president, is going to have carte blanche to do almost anything, especially in the area of judicial nominations, but more so because the Senate is almost indistinguishable in many ways. At least 10 more votes would be Mitt Romney and others that are going to go along with the Democrats most of the time. And unfortunately, that's just almost an absolute power type of situation where we could see fundamental changes in the structure of the Supreme Court. We could see all sorts of government largesse and spending bills getting passed that probably shouldn't be. So it's an unfortunate situation, in my opinion, but that's where we are right now.
Frank, on the issue of, as I put in my introduction, about just how popular or unpopular, in fact, the Senate as well as the Congress are in recent history, at least in Americans' minds, does this do anything in that regard? I mean, because there's always been that sort of complaint, right, that these two chambers aren't living up to what they're meant to be doing for the American people.
So there are a couple things I think at play. Is first of all, historically, Americans, we've never loved our politicians. There, are old jokes that go back to the Civil War that kind of indicate that politicians like children's diapers should be changed frequently. So there's very much a historic displeasure with politicians. However, currently, we've seen much more displeasure recently. Some stoked by media outlets, some genuine. And one thing to really note is that whether it be the U.S. presidential election, this Georgia Senate runoff, or other elections of this cycle, the race between Democrats and Republicans have been extremely close. Both of these runoffs were around 1% difference. Around 4.5 million votes were cast in this election. And the separation for the two candidates, one was around 73,000 votes. The other was around 35,000 votes. So it is really important to note that even though the Democrats will control both houses of Congress and the executive and legislative branch, the elections were extremely close. And so they do not really have a massive mandate to be able to go out and do whatever they want to do. Now, they may act like they will, but it is important to note that the elections were extremely close and that will have play, especially as things go forward for the midterms in 2022.
Jeffrey, what are your thoughts on the lack of popularity of these two chambers, as I put, the House of Representatives as well as the Senate in Americans' minds? Is it as Frank there said that that Americans are critical of their politicians, which is of course natural, I would think, in a democracy. But do you think that there are more, if I may use the word, basic issues maybe at play within these chambers that sort of create that image, at least, that they're not living up to what they're meant to be doing?
Well, you have people that have been in office for multiple decades. I mean, you look at the leadership in the Senate, and currently Mitch McConnell, who's Majority Leader McConnell, and you look at the leader of the House, who's Nancy Pelosi. I mean, both of them have been in office for multiple decades. When things switched to Chuck Schumer being the Senate Majority Leader, actually, if it's a 50-50, I'm not even sure how that works, but if it's shared power, but the Democrats are going to, since Kamala Harris is a Democrat, then it's going to be, then they'll have the majority as far as just because the vice president steps in when it's split. But Chuck Schumer has also been in power for many, many decades. as has Joe Biden. And that's a curious thing because it looked like he had very little support prior to the election. One notable thing about all of these people is that the people that seem to win these close elections all do so after the election ends on the day it's held. And it seems to be in the middle of the night, there's an injection of a whole lot of votes that seem to come from out of nowhere. And we have had so many different issues with voter registrations and with ineligible voters, possible tampering with machines. I mean, this is just, it's either the biggest power grab that's ever happened in American history outside of maybe the Civil War, or it's close and it's legitimate, like extremely close. I think there are a lot of issues that people are refusing to look into, that the Secretary of States have been blocking to stop anyone from really researching with the machines themselves, the software, the uploads of the results, the absentee ballots, people that are showing up and are already voted for by the time they get to the election in an absentee ballot when they never filled that out. Very little of this has actually really been investigated. And so the election doesn't seem legitimate, in my opinion, to many Republicans. And what we saw yesterday was, maybe 1 million people turn out in Washington, D.C., in multiple state houses. It's going to be ugly regardless of what happens, because it's close on the numbers, but a lot of people don't believe those numbers are legitimate.
Frank, let's talk then about what happened yesterday, in fact. What are your thoughts about what happened at the Capitol yesterday? It is a fact, is it not? There are significant enough numbers of people in the country that feel that things are not going right, that there is a threat to the American democratic system.
A couple things I wanted to kind of like push back on a little bit is that, the issues of electoral malfeasance have been investigated in all cases. Trump and his supporters have put forth almost 50 cases within, the courts. All of them have lost. The Supreme Court of the United States refused to hear his cases because they were baseless. The state secretaries have all certified the results. There have been investigations done by the FBI, and Attorney General William Barr, a Republican and Trump's own AG, has also confirmed that he believes that there was not sufficient electoral irregularities that would change the results of the election. So let's just start right there. Second, I would say is that absolutely. Now, there have been many changes that have kind of occurred kind of at a macro scale. The impact kind of social media, the rise of right-wing kind of quasi-journalism, as well as kind of QAnon and other kind of conspiracy theorist websites have kind of really led to kind of a small but very strong and very virulent thread of Trump supporters who kind of don't believe the election results. And Trump himself has really kind of stoked the fires on this and really kind of pushed his supporters to kind of, arguing that the election was illegitimate and that the results were not valid. Nothing could be farther from the truth. But the challenge is that for his own political reasons, Trump has really pushed this narrative. And it's been supported by a certain amount of U.S. media, which has created real challenges within the country. And what we saw yesterday was kind of the results of that playing out.
Jeffrey, we can probably argue, back and forth about whether or not there were discrepancies that need to be investigated, that did occur, that changed the results, irregularities, et cetera. But what I want to get to is the macro issue then of how this affects the way people view their own democratic system in the country, their voting system, their confidence in their government overall. And, for years, we've had, Republicans who've lived under Democrat administrations, obviously, and vice versa. And, we haven't had this level of doubt. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe we've had this level of doubt in the past. But this certainly can't be a good thing, can it?
I would definitely not agree that any of this has ever seen a courtroom as far as there being an adjudication of any kind that had to do with the merits of any of these vote or election fraud allegations. Never happened. If there was any sort of investigation by the FBI, I'm aware of one investigation with no results whatsoever, given to the public to reassure us. AG Barr did do an investigation prior to the election, I believe in the primaries, when he found that one person filled out over 1,000 ballots in Texas, and he said that the way that the states were holding their elections, doing mail-in ballots, was certain to cause voter fraud. So that combined with thousands of affidavits, multiple, maybe hundreds, or at least I'm aware of one case having 50 forensic evaluations of these machines by experts, not even seeing the light of day. So where anybody thinks that this has been fully investigated, vetted, and that's only conspiracy theorists who are left behind, is, I don't know where they're getting their news from, because they obviously haven't read the affidavits themselves, obviously haven't read the expert reports. I've read both. And you have many, many instances of people going to the polls, finding out that they'd already voted absentee when they did not. And they also were, and then they were given a provisional ballot in Georgia, and they're not even sure if that got counted. In Florida, you can cancel your ballot, and then you can, if you voted absentee, and then vote again. But if you have all of this stuff lingering, you have no sort of, court really weighing in on the evidence itself. They're all just saying we can't do anything about it. Well, if that's the case, then there is never a remedy. The only people that control the entire national government are a handful of secretaries of state, these counting centers in all these corrupt Democrat cities, and whoever they hire to pull out the briefcases or the suitcases afterwards, or run the ballots through 3 times. I've seen that in two different videos. It's how can anybody think this election was legitimate when there's tons of evidence that's never been considered by anyone? It's not something that's QAnon, quote unquote. It's not. It's something that's evidence-based. You can look in the cases themselves, look at the dockets, look at the exhibits. You'll see it for yourself. And it's something that, just blatantly dismiss it is just way, way, way off. And I know it's not everybody's thing, but if you're watching something other than CNN, you're going to see some of this stuff. Even Fox won't cover it completely, but you can look at the dockets. It's in the record. It's just not being considered. And that's why the government's not considered legitimate right now, because there's so much of this that was never considered by anybody. Everybody just turns the blind eye and walks away. Trump gets a record number of votes, and a guy in his basement gets 7 million more. How likely is that? He's 47 years in government and no enthusiasm whatsoever. And then all of a sudden, he's the 7 million vote man in the majority of all time, beating Obama.
Those are extremely good points. I apologize for cutting you off. It is just a question of time, so I do apologize. But we do sincerely appreciate both yourself and Frank for taking our time out and for sharing your expertise with us, viewers. We've given you, both points of view on this issue. And certainly it's one which, as I put to both of our guests, Jeffrey and Frank, again shows, right, just distrust in government and government establishments. So we've had, yes, these wins in Georgia on the part of Democrats. They do now control the Senate, but does that affect the issue of the lack of trust in these chambers and in these, these chambers of power, policy making? What does this mean going forward in the context, again, of what happened yesterday at the U.S. Capitol, the storming of the U.S. Capitol, Donald Trump's continuation of, casting doubt upon his election results? And Jeffrey, laid out the case there as well about the Republican side. We certainly need to hear the Republican side. It's not good enough to just dismiss it outright. We do need to hear the other side, because whether we like it or not, and whether it's true or not, obviously I can't know that for a fact. We need to know at least what both sides are thinking to be able to then, for any government, be it president like Biden or anybody in the future, to be able to govern properly. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss hate crimes in the United States. It won't come as a surprise to many of you watching that according to U.S. law enforcement agencies, hate crimes went up drastically during the Trump presidency from 2016 till the present day. The statistics don't lie. Murders classified as hate crimes have more than doubled. And this is specifically in more recent years of 2018 to 2019. And then the FBI has also found that 17% spike in reported cases between 2016 and 2017 also, and then 7,314 criminal hate crime incidents were reported to the FBI just in the year 2019. Now, to discuss all of that a bit further, I'm joined by Dr. Nazia Kazi, who's an associate professor of anthropology at Stockton University. She's joining us this morning from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Nazia, thank you very much for your time. What do you make of these sorts of hate crime statistics? I would think that there is no surprise here. But the fact that everyone is being targeted, and I mean by that Muslims and Jews more specifically, and it's a wider range of people, that's worrying also, isn't it?
Indeed. So I'm coming to you from Philadelphia, and I'm sure many of your viewers have been observing the chaos, shall we call it, that has descended upon the capital of the United States as there's this sort of coup attempt that is single-handedly motivated by racial animus. So, for instance, you mentioned, the spike in anti-Semitism in the U.S. I noticed in some of the images of this this situation that unfolded yesterday. I noticed one of the protesters, domestic terrorists, whatever term you want to use, was wearing a sweatshirt that said Camp Auschwitz on it, invoking the Holocaust and a concentration camp. So I think what you're pointing to is a truly troubling feature of life in the United States. But I think it's important to remember that what we might understand as sort of religious bigotry is usually more aptly understood as a form of racism, especially in the U.S. context. So there's a long-standing history of things that might seem superficially to be issues of religious bigotry. So, for instance, the centuries-long sort of anti-Catholic bias that existed in the U.S. might present itself as religious bigotry, but indeed what it actually was a fierce disregard for people of Irish descent that existed during the settling of the United States. And I think we can say the same now about Islamophobia in the U.S., that in fact, what might seem to be a form of religious bigotry is actually a form of racism, right? That wears the cloak of religious bigotry. So I think that's an important framework for understanding the issues that you're raising. And I think, we would be remiss to not think about, the ways in which a Trump presidency has emboldened these elements, in that it is sort of overtly ethno-nationalist for these entire past 4 years. The Trump administration has been making gestures toward religious bigots, racial bigots, etc. And this has a long history in the U.S. that is not limited to the Trump administration alone.
On that, Nazia, the fact that there's a long history of this sort of racism, be it towards different groups, certainly, as you correctly pointed out in your first answer there. I wonder then why in the year 2020 enough or all these people still very much are racist. And the reason I'm asking that is because the U.S. was very much founded, and it always at least propagates itself as a place which is very accepting. And that's not to say, of course, that all Americans are racist. I'm not trying to say that. Certainly, I don't want to overstate the issue, but significant enough people are still racist. And that sort of defies logic at the level of what we understand the United States to be.
Indeed. And I think one of the problems, one of the mistakes we make is locating racism or bigotry in the hearts and minds of any individual. I think when we move away from thinking about racism as a problem of prejudice or individual intolerance that afflicts a single person, we kind of miss the big picture, which is that American bigotry is systemic, right? I mean, we can't understand the white supremacist mobs that raided the Capitol building last night. We can't understand them without understanding the police who literally opened the barricade and let them in. I mean, for those of us who have been in the streets, since the murder of George Floyd in U.S. cities across the country, protesting against racial violence, what we saw from the police yesterday, where they are taking selfies, with these armed protesters, where they're opening the barricades to let them in. I just saw an image of, a police officer in riot gear helping one of these rioters down the steps, holding her hand. And for those of us who spent our summers and our falls in the streets, protesting racial violence, who were tear gassed, who were arrested. I have a dear comrade in Philadelphia who is looking at federal charges, in the midst of this movement for racial justice. And so for those of us who see that, we see the disparity, and then we begin to recognize that the problem of racism in the U.S. is not really a problem of individuals thinking or feeling a certain way in 2020. It is that there is a whole economic and political and cultural system set up that propagates racism, right? I mean, it's easy to think about, overt white nationalists who are hate-filled, who protest outside of a masjid that's being built. It's easy to label that racism. But what about the fact that the water of the city of Flint, Michigan, a predominantly Black city, was deliberately poisoned by city officials? Undrinkable water that devastated the health of an entire city. How do we make sense of that? And when we begin to ask these questions, we begin to see that it's kind of a false assumption to assume that as the years progress, the U.S. makes progress on matters of race. That has not been the case. It was just a few years ago, that we saw Native American, indigenous protesters seeing their land violated once again for the construction of an oil and gas pipeline at Standing Rock. And this is happening across not just the United States, but Canada as well. So if we can begin to see these things as connected.
So I wanted to ask you one final question, if you allow me. I do apologize for cutting you off there. You made a really good point there about the systemic issues, right? But one of the things that I've striking me as a bit ironic here is the fact that, when we talk about Islamophobia, for example, we sometimes look at it, and certainly it happened before 9/11 too, but after 9/11, we look at the way that, the U.S. reacted and, the laws enacted after that, and sort of this complete narrative of mistrust towards Muslims. But then on the issue of Jews, I find it interesting because to have anti-Semitism grow, especially under a Republican president who has done and spoken so much in support of the likes of Israel, and I know I'm bringing in foreign policy into this, that sort of defies logic, because at the same time we're saying we're gung-ho in support of Israel, regardless of, Palestinian issue. I don't want to go into that for this show. But at the same time, we're also anti-Semitic. Like it sort of doesn't, work together, does it?
I mean, on one level, we remember what happened in Charlottesville in 2017 when these ethno-nationalists were chanting Nazi slogans, anti-Semitic slogans, marching through the streets. I remember one of those guys was interviewed afterward, and he said he really liked Trump, but couldn't understand why Donald Trump let his beautiful daughter walk around with a Jewish husband. Okay, so there's an interesting tension that you're highlighting there, but I think we actually really need to be careful in distinguishing Israel from, the Jewish diaspora, and especially in the U.S. tries really hard to equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And what this does is it actually reinforces a type of anti-Semitism. I mean, it assumes that Jewish Americans have a uniform political view of Israel, when in fact, when you talk to Jewish Americans, many of them are really, really critical of the apartheid, the settler colonialism, the militarized violence that exists in this settler colonial state. And so the U.S., in trying to equate Israel with Jewish identity, is itself committing an act of anti-Semitic violence in doing so.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, Nazia, to end on. And thank you for clarifying that, certainly for our viewers, because I didn't mean, obviously, to say that all American Jews sign on to Israel and what it does towards the Palestinians, but we sincerely appreciate you taking our time out this morning to speak to us there from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Hate crime going up in the U.S., especially during the Trump presidency. For a lot of us on the outside, viewing in, who've been on the outside of the U.S., it doesn't seem like a surprise for many, I would imagine, in the U.S., especially those who are minorities, be they Muslims, Jews, or others. Not a surprise again. Is this down to just Donald Trump? As Nazia there said, it's not necessarily just an issue of one man, right? It's not an issue of just the Republican Party, for example, but these sort of systemic issues that we can talk about from way in history, American history, that is, of course, as well. Are we looking at this the right way? Or are we looking at these things as individual cases when they're a lot more overt? What about the fact that, as Nazia also mentioned, there are water issues in Flint? and other such issues as well, all of that is also indicative of racism. And the fact that even in the year 2020, where we all think of the US as an extremely accepting country, which largely on the part of the people it is, systemically it is not. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.